Hello and welcome to the Providence College podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. Here on the Providence College podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Fryer family. This week, we're talking with Shannon Rafferty Sullivan from the class of 2000. In July, she was appointed President and Chief Operating Officer of Women and Infants Hospital in Providence. Sullivan was a social work major at PC and spent most of her career at Women and Infants, starting as a clinical social worker in 2002 until she became Director of Patient and Family Support Services in 2016. In 2018, Sullivan was named Chief Operating Officer for the Care New England System and Kent Hospital, and she became Interim Chief Operating Officer of Women and Infants the following year. As the pandemic became more serious, she oversaw the creation of field hospitals in Rhode Island. And last year, the Providence Business Journal gave her a Businesswoman Award as an industry leader in healthcare services. Shannon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Liz, thank you so much. This is the best thing I've done all week.
Well, I feel like during the pandemic, I've been joking that a lot of people, ordinary people without any scientific background, became armchair epidemiologists and suddenly had a lot of opinions about supply chain management. I'm curious, in your role, working in operations, what have been the biggest challenges for you, managing operations for the hospitals at this time?
It's interesting because when COVID hit back in February, if you remember, it was such a novel virus that the daily management of, to your point, supply chain and persons, and quite frankly, just the management of our staff's anxiety and our own anxiety was the main focus at that time. And now we look back at those times and we think, God, those numbers weren't even that high, right? And we thought at the time they were just awful. And so every phase of this disease has brought a different twist and a different operational change. Here at Women and Infants, we had to stop allowing visitors in the hospital. We never actually, some of the New York hospitals stopped letting dads in. We never did that. That was not something that met with our mission, but we haven't had visitors back in the hospital since that time. So visitor management from an operations point of view became something different that we hadn't really thought of before. We'd spent so much time in our history trying to open things up and making sure that we were patient and family centered and patients would be able to choose who they brought in. And then we had to ramp back on all of that and figuring out how we would get food to our families in a different way, and figuring out we had to close our cafeteria. We couldn't do baby photos anymore. We were screening, all of our staff as they came in. We had a really high absenteeism from people who were in quarantine but not necessarily sick, and so it was labor management, and it was supply chain management, and it was security management and food delivery management, and all of those little things that sort of came together. And with each new wave, we learned something different. And I don't think we'll ever nail this down as something we say we're comfortable with, but I think we're at a point right now where we really do feel like we're living with COVID as opposed to figuring out COVID. And that's a better place to be than we were 10 months ago.
It seems like such a harsh reality, though, because I think when we think back to March, when things got really serious in Rhode Island and schools started shutting down, everyone thought it was just going to be a couple of weeks. And like you said, it just became phases instead of, short bursts of change.
And it was really, it was hard on a lot of different families for a lot of different reasons. I think a lot of families ended up, as we were sort of talking before we got online, all of a sudden being together all the time, and really not having a lot of outlets. We're social people by nature, and so not having the same social nature to it, and then spending a lot of time with your loved ones and realizing that they sort of annoy you at times. And then my family having the complete opposite experiences, that we had COVID hit and I sort of left the house and was gone for long periods of time, and my husband was home with my 3 children, and having that dichotomy for them, like they're telling everybody to stay home and yet my mom keeps leaving, and what does that mean and what does that look like? But I think Rhode Island in general has done a good job as getting things back to as normal, and I put that in quotation marks, as it possibly can. And I am hopeful now that the vaccine is here and has been proven so effective, and we've seen that in the numbers, will start to feel a little bit more normal in the spring.
I was really struck in researching for this pod that that you average about 8,500 births at women and infants every year. And like you said, it's such an important moment when someone's family expands and grows to add new people. So what were some of the things you mentioned? Visitor management. Were there ways you were able to keep that experience special for people? I'm sure that you had people literally trying to beat down the door to see grandchildren and cousins and whatnot.
It was really interesting. We had grandparents certainly trying to beat down the door, but also really scared that they would bring something in and not necessarily wanting to be near new babies. And then we had like two sets of patients, really. We had the sets of patients who were, very sad that their families and their friends couldn't come in and see their babies here in the hospital and what that meant to them. And then we had, and I'm sorry to laugh, but we had the other group of people who were like, thank God you didn't let my mother-in-law in. I just wanted to be alone for 36 hours. And so we really experienced both pieces of that. And we weren't able to do baby photos anymore because we didn't have, we used to do the professional baby photos. And so there were a variety of things that we lost. But I think what we gained and what has grounded us during this time is really, despite everything happening in the world, people are still having children and experiencing joy and coming together as a family and having, there's few moments that you as a woman and really as a couple probably remember better than the day you have your baby. Like that is cemented in your head. You can't remember what you ate for lunch, but you can second by second tell the people what happened that day. And so that remains alive, and that sort of like promise of a new generation. And really, we like to say that everybody's story starts here. You start your story here every day. And those stories are still happening. They just look a little bit different to our families.
Right. People their families are expanding. They're not necessarily coming together in the same way as they would have, a year or two ago, right from that first day. But like you said, maybe that's a good thing for some families. Maybe some families.
Although FaceTime is a miraculous thing,
Absolutely. Thank goodness for technology. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit how you transitioned from your clinical role as a social worker to administration. What was that transition like?
I could have never imagined that I would end up one day as the president of Women and Infants Hospital. That thought process and those words wouldn't have even been in my vernacular. I went to PC and I graduated in 2000, and then right from there I went to Boston College to get my master's in social work, and I graduated there in 2002. And I worked up there for a little while, and then I was offered this job at Women and Infants a couple months after I finished grad school. And I remember when I got this job at Women and Infants thinking I would work at Women and Infants forever, that I would be a clinical social worker here forever. I loved the work. I loved the people. And I spent many years working in our sort of emergency room, postpartum, labor room floors. And then I transferred at one point to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, and I loved it. And I thought, this is it. I will retire from this job. I will stay here forever. And then our chief nurse at the time came to find me on the floor one day, which was really interesting, right? We have 2,500 employees, and the chief nurse is looking for you, and obviously think you're about to get fired. And what horrible thing that I do that I need to be called down for. And she said, I keep walking into these meetings and I ask people a question and they say, well, we're going to have to call Shannon, the social worker, about that because she might have an idea of what that should look like. And she said, I just feel like we have something in you and I need to find out what that is. And so it was a couple different things. It was really, really good mentors along the way. And it was every time I had an opportunity, just sort of following the road and taking that opportunity and being able to do it. And so the transition from clinical social worker to hospital administrator, actually, it didn't feel like that far a leap. It sort of felt like I went from helping families problem solve some of the issues in their lives to helping the hospital problem solve some of our macro issues of what was happening here. And and operations and social work sort of went hand in hand in that. I just found something that I was sort of good at and followed the road from there. And so, and when I left here a few years ago to go to Kent Hospital and to the health system, I really didn't think I'd be back. I thought that would be work that I'd be doing, and I would spend some time down there, more time than I did. And so when this opportunity came, and I came back, I can say wholeheartedly that besides, having my 3 children, this opportunity and this work that we're doing here is the greatest privilege of my life. There's few things that matter more to me than affecting the health of women and children in this region. And so it's really humbling. It's the most humbling experience. And some days I still walk in and I'm like, I'm waiting for someone to be like, this isn't your office. This is for someone else. But the transition really was because I had great leaders. I had great leaders helping me, and I still do. We have a fantastic CEO, and he remains a great mentor for me.
So it sounded like you knew that social work was going to be your ambition right from the beginning. What inspired you to follow that path, and which then led you in a little different path than you might have envisioned when you were a college student?
I came to PC and I was an undecided major. I thought about pre-med. Honestly, I thought that I might go into biology. I really liked biology. I thought that was going to be interesting for me, but I came in undecided because I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I really, really wasn't good at calculus, to be honest. I was really good at biology, but not so good at calculus. And so I floundered around a little bit that first year of my freshman year. I think like a lot of us do, just trying to figure out like what classes do I like, what teachers do I like, what sort of speaks to me. I had a lot of friends who were education majors, but I knew that probably wasn't the right thing for me. And I had been volunteering. I'd always volunteered. I volunteered a lot through high school, and then I was volunteering in college and spending a lot of time at some domestic violence shelters, and then some of infectious disease clinics. And I had a really good friend who said to me, Shannon, you'd be a really good social worker. Have you ever thought about that? And I was like, social worker? What are you talking about? But then my sophomore year, first semester, I took the Intro to Social Work course, and I really loved it. I had Dr. Marion Madison was teaching there at the time. I don't know if she's still there, but she was teaching there at the time. And she was also just a great mentor. And so I was really drawn to it. And it was clear that was the right path for me. And then I wanted to go get my master's right away because I was scared that if I stopped, I wouldn't go back. So that seemed like the right thing too. So it always really was just following the path and seeing what happened next. I had never had sort of a preordained thought in my head of how this was going to end up, and I'm still interested to see how it all ends up. But that's how it started, and it served me well thus far.
So you mentioned Dr. Madison. I'm curious if there are other professors or classes that you, when in your current role, that you think back to and you draw upon for, inspiration or guidance. Are there any readings or classes that really stuck with you from your undergraduate days? So,
as torturous as it was, Western Civ ended up in life being really helpful, because I was at PC when it was 5 days a week, when it was the 20 credit class. And, as difficult as that is for a college student, 5 days a week for 2 years, I found it really helpful just in the way that liberal arts helps your mind think, and how that whole integrated platform of the program of philosophy and theology and English and history came together. So I don't think I understood that at the time, but I really appreciated it as I got older and I went back to school. And then I went back to school again to get a second master's. And in doing both of those things, I realized just how much the Western Civ curriculum contributed to my ability to learn just in general. I also took Father Guido taught a class my senior year, a psychology class, the psychology of religion, which was a fascinating class. And I can't tell you much about what we actually learned. It's been too long, 21 years later. but I can tell you that it inspired me to think differently, and that it sort of recommitted me to a lot of the mission of PC and what had drawn me to PC to begin with. And then, of course, Dr. Madison's classes were excellent in the social work department. And then we had a Dr. Hayes who taught research. And I remember that helped me really understand that I also liked research, and I'm still involved in research now. But everything, there were just a lot of classes, and what I loved about PC is you could learn anything. They really taught you to think differently, and they challenged you to think differently. I also studied abroad my junior year, and that was a big, that provided me with a lot of experiences that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Where did you go?
I went to Florence, Italy.
It's still a very popular destination for PC students today.
It's fantastic.
I wanted to ask you about, the skills that you have as a social, your foundation as a social worker, do they help you in your role today as a healthcare leader now?
I always say that some days I just go back to being a social worker, and that gets me through the day. Yesterday, we had a management team, and so I did a lecture in my management team on conscious leadership and courageous leadership, and being, listening for learning and not listening to be right. Because I think oftentimes as leaders, we get so cemented in what is right. And I think in today's society, I think what we're seeing societally is that people are cemented in listening to react and listening to be right. And so clinical social work is really, for me, about two things. It's listening to learn and listening to really understand, even if we're not going to agree, and even if we end up going down the road that we still need to go down. But that active listening piece really helps you partner with a wide variety of people. And then also just, the empathy and the understanding. When you're a social worker, oftentimes, especially in acute care hospital, working in an emergency room, you see people on their worst day. Oftentimes the worst day of their entire lives, they're meeting you. And that holding that with you and understanding that helps you understand just how lucky you are in your own experiences, and that life does in fact go on, and that carrying that empathy with you as a leader, because lots of people are waking up to that worst day, and it's not yours.
So you were very involved in the development of the field hospitals here in Rhode Island, and unfortunately, in December, the site in Cranston had to open. How are you feeling about that, and what were some of the challenges in setting up that facility?
That may have been my most challenging experience professionally. I got a call on a Saturday night at about 7 o'clock from our CEO. And it's always bad news, really. It's always something challenging when your CEO is calling you at 7 o'clock on a Saturday night. And I picked up the phone, and he said, I got a favor, Shan, I got a favor. And every time he's ever asked me for a favor, it's always ended up resulting in something kind of crazy and fun. But he said, the governor just called. They're asking us to turn an office building in Cranston into a field hospital with the help of Demio Construction and the National Guard and the state. And we need someone to run it, and we need someone to get it together. And you have about 28 days. And so do you think you can do that? And I've never said no to him, and I wasn't going to say no to him now. So we actually completed that in 23 days. There's not enough words to talk about the team that worked on that project. The construction team was there 24/7 through Easter, working constantly. It really, it was an office building with hundreds of cubicles. It was a call center, and we tore that whole thing down and we turned it into a hospital. And then we had to figure out, well, how do we care for patients here? And what do the clinical protocols look like? And what does the documentation look like? Because we're not going to have our electronic medical record. And how do we get supplies in? And where's our hot zone? And where's our cold zone? And how are we going to staff it? And are we going to have a pharmacy? And what's the pharmacy going to have in it? Can we have all of our different types of drugs or not enough of our drugs? And what's security going to look like? And do we have to build bathrooms? And it was, I've had one other professional experience in my life where I've worked that many hours in such a short period of time. And the best part is when you get to do a job for your community with that big of an impact, and you get to do it with a team you really like. And so luckily, the president of Kent Hospital, which was where I was at the time, let me pick my nursing leadership and my physician leadership to bring over to help. So I took our nurse leader of the OR and our emergency room chief, and we went over there with a couple other people, and we worked for 23 days straight, several, at times 18, 20 hours a day to get it done. And it never felt like, it never felt that bad. It's one of those things you look back and you're like, wow, I can't believe how much we did during that short period of time. But the team was so great, and we had so much fun. I hate to say it like that. We drank a lot of coffee, a lot of coffee. And it ended up being, quite frankly, the experience of a lifetime. And I hoped that they would never open it. I hoped that it was just going to be a great thing that we did. And then it became clear in November we were going to have to open it. So at that time, I transferred control, if you will, to my friend, Dr. Pari Gopalakrishnan, because at that time I'd moved to women and infants and they really needed me here. And so he's been there, and the same team that we built it with, like, they're there every day and night. They're still there. And so I don't think people realize, even though the numbers are smaller than we thought they were going to be at that hospital, how dedicated the leadership team continues to be. And there's the OR director I spoke of earlier. He has been there every single day since it opened. He has slept there many nights, and it really just shows how he feels about his community and what he's willing to do to keep them safe.
When we started hearing the news about the possibility of field hospitals, I think everyone was feeling the same way. Like, glad it'll be there, hope we never have to use it. But here we are in February, and it's been open for several months now. So you mentioned the long days, and you also mentioned, you have pretty young kids right now. So how has the pandemic been for you as a parent, and you and your husband, who's also a PC alum, correct?
Yep, my husband graduated in 97. Patrick Sullivan graduated in 97 from PC, and it's been challenging, like for any family. I think it's just different challenging. So our kids are our future Friar kids are 11, 8, and 5. Our youngest just started kindergarten, and like every parent, our kids just came home from school one day in March and didn't go back. I think that was hardest on my, at the time, 10-year-old son. 10-year-old boys are rambunctious and social and play sports and play video games together and hang out with their friends, and transitioning him to online learning with very little social interaction was really challenging. And then on the opposite side, I had a preschooler who was being sent home. And so preschool basically stopped. I mean, we had some homeschooling to do, but preschool basically stopped at that time. And, behaviorally, she had a really hard time. She's also my kids are very social beings. They're like their mother. They're very social beings. And the difficulty for me as a parent was watching them struggle with the isolation, the unknown, and the things that they were hearing through TV and radio and through their friends that was scary to them, and then having to reconcile for them why I was still leaving every day and what that looked like and what that happened. But the cool thing really is that they did get to come to the field hospital sort of at the end before we opened it. I brought them down one day. Unexpectedly, the governor wanted to come down and see the field hospital, and it was on a Saturday, and I didn't, my husband was out when we found out, and I had to zip down, so I had the kids and I zipped down, And they were in the car, and I had the National Guard babysitting them in the car. God bless the National Guardsmen. I didn't know what else to do. And then the governor came out, and she knocked on the window, and they rolled it down, and she's like, "Your mom did all of this. Can you believe that?" And they were like, "What? She comes home and makes dinner. What?" But they got to see something that they should be proud of, that they got to, and so I think we struggled just like every parent. I think we're still struggling with figuring out, especially they're playing less sports, they're seeing less of their friends. We are lucky to be in a community where our kids are back in school full time. That's a savior for us, and God bless those teachers who go to work every day, and really are our own direct line workers. But it's evolving, and our family luckily hasn't gotten sick and hasn't seen the illness, and we've also managed together. But there's the families who not only have had to manage illness, but then a lot more behavioral health issues, both for themselves and their children, as they manage the isolation. So we've been really lucky, and we know that. But as a society, I think it's going to take us a little while to get out of it.
With so many challenges in it, and I definitely recognize that there have been so many families that have dealt with such tragedy. So I feel a little, this is a lighter question, but I'm just curious, you mentioned coffee got you through those 20-hour days. When you were building the field hospital, were there any things that you or your family were able to do that, you look back on as a silver lining that, did you develop a habit or a tradition or a pandemic hobby as a family or yourself that helped you, beat some of the stress and the isolation that we're all experiencing?
Yeah. It's funny. So camps were canceled, right, this summer, and my kids always go to camps over the summer, but the one camp that was running was sailing camp. And so my kids who had never sailed before, I was like, guess what? You're sailing. And they loved it. My daughters did. My daughters loved it. And then my son took up golf with my husband, which is something, my husband's an avid golfer, but my son hadn't got into it before. And we ended up doing, the quieter holidays, as different as that was, ended up being a lot, pretty special for us to be by ourselves. And we played a lot of board games. When you're talking about hobbies, we are like Monopoly freaks now. My son, all he wanted was different kinds of Monopoly for Christmas. He wanted Red Sox Monopoly and regular Monopoly and Star Wars Monopoly. So I don't know that that's, a great memory, but I certainly think that we have spent more time together as a family and probably appreciate what we have more than we did at the beginning of the pandemic.
Well, Janet, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We appreciate it. It was great to hear about these experiences. It was like on your end of the planning and dealing with this pandemic. Subscribe to the Providence College podcast in all the usual places, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, as well as your smart speaker. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.